The difference between the person who survives the storm and the person who gets destroyed by it is rarely talent, rarely luck, and almost never circumstance. It is almost always something happening quietly, invisibly, and with absolute consistency inside the mind. Let me tell you something about winners that nobody puts in the highlight reel. It is not the moment of victory that defines them. Not the trophy, not the standing ovation, not the headline. What defines them is what was happening in their mind on the Tuesday morning 6 months before any of that, when nothing was working, when the results weren't showing up, when every reasonable person around them was suggesting, gently or not so gently, that it might be time to reconsider. What were they thinking on that Tuesday morning? That is the real question. And that is exactly what we are answering today. Because a positive mental attitude, a genuinely unbreakable one, the kind that doesn't crumble under pressure or dissolve in difficulty, is not a personality trait you are born with or without. It is not optimism as a feeling. It is not the relentless performance of cheerfulness that exhausts everyone including the person performing it. It is a practice. A set of specific, learnable, repeatable habits of thought, rooted in one of the most battle-tested philosophical traditions in human history, that produce, over time, a mind so grounded and so resilient that the things that break most people simply cannot find sufficient purchase in you to do their work. The Stoics called this ascesis, the disciplined training of the inner self. And today, we are going to walk through 10 of the most powerful habits that emerge from that tradition. Not as inspiration. As instruction. Let's begin. Habit 1, they decide what things mean. Here is the most important thing the Stoics ever said, and I want you to receive it not as a philosophical abstraction but as a practical, life-altering truth. Nothing has meaning until you assign it one. Marcus Aurelius, Emperor of Rome, commander of armies, a man who faced plague, war, betrayal, and the crushing weight of governing the most powerful empire in the ancient world, wrote in his private journals, "If you are distressed by anything external, the pain is not due to the thing itself, but to your estimate of it, and this you have the power to revoke at any moment." Read that again. Slowly. The pain is not in the thing. The pain is in the estimate of the thing. And the estimate belongs to you. A man named Richard lost his job on a Thursday afternoon in November. His colleague Marcus lost his job on the same day, from the same company, under the same circumstances. Richard spent the next 3 months in a state of shame and paralysis. The story he told himself was this: "I have failed. I am not enough. The world has confirmed what I always feared about myself." Marcus spent those same 3 months building the business he had always been too comfortable to start. The story he told himself was this: "The decision has been made for me. The door I was too afraid to walk through has been opened by force. Let's go." Same event. Same Thursday. Same November. Completely different meanings. Completely different outcomes. Winners are not people to whom only good things happen. They are people who have developed, through practice, through philosophy, through the disciplined refusal to surrender their interpretive authority to circumstance, the habit of assigning meanings that serve their forward motion rather than their defeat. This is not delusion. It is not pretending the difficulty isn't real. It is the sovereign, conscious, Stoic decision to ask, always, in every situation, what meaning can I assign to this that makes me more capable rather than less? That question, asked consistently, is the beginning of an unbreakable mind. Habit 2, they make friends with difficulty. Every winner you have ever admired has a relationship with difficulty that would make most people deeply uncomfortable. They do not tolerate it. They do not merely endure it. They have developed, and this takes time and honest self-examination, a genuine, functional appreciation for what difficulty does to a mind that engages with it rather than retreating from it. Think about what happens, physiologically and neurologically, when a human being regularly engages with genuine challenge. New neural pathways form. Stress response systems become calibrated and efficient rather than wild and overwhelming. The prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for judgment, planning, and emotional regulation, becomes more robust. Tolerance for ambiguity increases. The gap between a problem appearing and panic setting in widens into a space where actual thinking can happen. Difficulty, engaged with consistently, is not an obstacle to mental strength. It is the primary mechanism by which mental strength is built. Epictetus, who began his life as a slave, who had no freedom, no property, no external power of any kind, became one of the most psychologically formidable human beings who ever lived. Not despite his circumstances. Not in spite of the difficulty. Because of the daily, inescapable, unrelenting practice that difficulty forced upon him. He wrote, "Seek not that the things which happen should happen as you wish, but wish the things which happen to be as they are, and you will have a tranquil flow of life." This is not passive resignation. This is the active, disciplined choice to engage with reality as it is, and to find in that engagement the material for building something unbreakable. A young woman named Adise grew up in circumstances that most people would describe as disadvantaged. Limited resources. Unstable environment. Very little of what success culture tells us we need in order to succeed. What Adise had was a grandmother who told her, every single morning, something that became the operating system of her mind. Hard things are not happening to you. Hard things are happening for you. Pay attention to what they are teaching. Adise paid attention. And what difficulty taught her, over years of engagement rather than avoidance, was a quality of resilience, creativity, and emotional intelligence that no comfortable path could have produced. Make friends with difficulty. Not as a performance of toughness, but as the honest recognition that the hard thing in front of you is the exact instrument your mind needs to become what it is capable of becoming. Habit 3, they protect their inner conversation. There is a conversation happening inside you right now. There has been one happening since you were old enough to form thoughts. And that conversation, the one you have with yourself in the quiet moments, in the hard moments, in the moments when no one is watching and there is no performance required, is the single most influential conversation of your entire life. More influential than anything any mentor ever said to you. More influential than any book, any speech, any piece of advice from any external source. Because the inner conversation is the one that is always running. The background process that colors every experience, filters every piece of information, and shapes the emotional tone of your existence from the moment you wake until the moment you sleep. Winners guard this conversation with a ferocity that can look, from the outside, almost like obsession. They are ruthlessly attentive to the quality of the narration playing in their own minds. They catch the voice that says you can't and they interrogate it. They notice the pattern that says this always happens to me and they challenge it. They identify the story that says I am the kind of person who, and they examine it, not to be gentle with themselves, not to bypass honest self-assessment, but to ensure that the story they are living inside is one they actually chose rather than one that was handed to them by fear, by old wounds, by the accumulated weight of other people's opinions about who they are. Marcus Aurelius did this every single morning in his journals. He did not write to be published. He wrote to audit himself. To hold his inner conversation up to the light of his values and ask, honestly and without mercy, whether his thinking was serving wisdom or serving weakness. He caught himself catastrophizing and redirected. He caught himself seeking approval and redirected. He caught himself attaching his peace to outcomes he couldn't control and redirected. Every single day. Without exception. Because he understood something that most people never fully grasp. The quality of your life is the quality of your habitual thoughts. Not your occasional thoughts. Not your best thoughts. Your habitual thoughts, the ones that run automatically, below conscious awareness, shaping your reality before you have even decided how you want to see it. Protect that conversation. Examine it daily. Challenge it when it serves fear. Redirect it when it serves smallness. And replace it, patiently, consistently, without self-judgment, with a narration that serves the person you are working to become. Habit 4. They separate facts from the story they tell about facts. This habit is one of the most practically powerful on this entire list. And it is one of the least practiced. Here is what most people do when something difficult happens. They experience the fact and the story about the fact as a single, inseparable thing. They cannot tell you where the event ends and their interpretation of it begins. To them, the interpretation is the event. The story is the reality. Winners have trained themselves, through deliberate, repeated practice, to hold these two things apart. A presentation goes poorly. That is a fact. This means I am not good enough and will never be taken seriously, and everyone in that room now thinks I am incompetent. That is a story. A relationship ends. That is a fact. This means I am fundamentally unlovable and this pattern will repeat forever. That is a story. The Stoics called this distinction the difference between the fantasia, the initial impression, and the synkatathesis, the assent, the agreement, the decision to accept the impression as true. And they taught, relentlessly, across generations, that the assent is always a choice. You cannot always control the initial impression. The difficult event lands, the emotion arises, the first thought appears, and all of that happens faster than conscious decision-making can intervene. But the story you build on top of that first impression, that is yours. Entirely and completely yours. And a winner builds stories that are honest about the facts while refusing to extrapolate from those facts in directions that serve despair rather than growth. Not why does this always happen to me, but what is this asking me to develop? Not I am clearly not capable of this, but what skill am I missing and how do I build it? Not this is a sign that I should stop, but this is data. What does it tell me? Facts are neutral. They carry no inherent meaning until a mind assigns one. Assign meanings that build you. Habit 5, they practice voluntary discomfort. This habit will sound strange. And I want you to stay with it long enough to understand why it is one of the most powerful things on this list. The Stoics had a practice they called melody, deliberate rehearsal. And one of its most important applications was the practice of voluntarily placing themselves in conditions of discomfort, not because they were masochists, but because they understood something about the psychology of fear that modern science has since confirmed in precise neurological detail. Fear loses its power over things you have already survived. Seneca regularly fasted, not because he was hungry, but to practice indifference to hunger. He wore simple clothing on cold days, not because he lacked warmth, but to demonstrate to himself that he could. He would periodically live as if his wealth had disappeared, to prove to himself that his peace was not contingent on its presence. This was not performance. This was training. Because a mind that has voluntarily experienced discomfort, and discovered that it survived, that it remained functional, that the feared thing was in fact survivable, is a mind that no longer lives in the grip of that particular fear. And a mind not ruled by fear is capable of things that a fear-governed mind simply cannot access. Think about what voluntary discomfort practice looks like in practical terms today. The difficult conversation you keep postponing, have it. Not because the moment is perfect, but because avoiding it is training your mind to be ruled by the discomfort of conflict. The physical challenge that intimidates you, pursue it. Not for the physical result alone, but because every time your body wants to stop and your mind says keep going, you are building the exact same mental muscle that will keep you going when the difficulty is not physical but existential. The creative work you are afraid to show because it might be judged, show it. Because every act of courage in the face of vulnerability is a deposit in the account of mental toughness. Comfort, pursued as a primary goal, produces a mind that is increasingly fragile, because it has been trained to expect ease and is therefore devastated by anything that isn't. Voluntary discomfort, practiced consistently, produces a mind that is increasingly unbreakable, because it has been trained to function, and even to thrive, precisely in the conditions that most people spend their lives trying. 5 habits in. And I want you to feel the architecture of what we are building here. This is not a collection of motivational ideas to feel good about for an afternoon. This is the actual operating system of the most mentally resilient human beings who have ever walked this earth, refined over 2,000 years of Stoic philosophy and validated by every modern understanding of how extraordinary minds are built. They decide what things mean, and they decide in favor of their forward motion. They make friends with difficulty, and let it do the work of building them. They protect their inner conversation, and audit it daily with honesty and without mercy. They separate facts from stories, and build stories that serve growth rather than defeat. They practice voluntary discomfort, and become, through that practice, genuinely unbreakable. In next part and NBSP, we complete the 10. And the 5 habits waiting for you in the next part are the ones that take everything built here and turn it into something sustainable. Something that doesn't just produce results on good days, but holds, completely and without compromise, on the hardest ones. There is a particular kind of person who does not break. Not because life has been kind to them. Not because the storms they have faced were smaller than yours. But because somewhere along the way, through practice, through philosophy, through the quiet and unglamorous daily discipline of training their mind, they built something inside themselves that difficulty simply cannot dismantle. You have been building that in part 1. Now we finish it. 5 more habits. The ones that take everything constructed in the first part and make it permanent. The ones that transform a positive mental attitude from something you perform on good days into something you are on every day, especially the ones that test you most completely. Let's go. Habit 6, they think in long arcs, not short reactions. One of the most consistent differences between a winner's mind and an ordinary mind is the time horizon they are thinking within at any given moment. Most people, when something goes wrong, are thinking in hours. Sometimes in minutes. They are reacting to the immediate emotional temperature of the situation, making decisions and drawing conclusions from the narrow, distorted perspective of the present moment, a perspective that, almost without exception, makes everything look worse than it actually is. Winners think in years. Sometimes in decades. And that shift in time horizon changes everything about how a difficulty appears. There was a businessman named Lawrence who lost everything he had built over 11 years in the span of about 4 months. Market forces he hadn't anticipated. Decisions that seemed sound at the time but unraveled in ways he couldn't have fully predicted. By the end of those 4 months, he had almost nothing left in material terms and a reputation he would need to spend years rebuilding. In the immediate moment, measured in days, in weeks, this looked like total destruction. And Lawrence felt it that way. He was not a robot. He was a human being sitting in the rubble of something he had built with his hands and his years and his heart. But Lawrence had spent a decade reading Stoic philosophy. And in the middle of the rubble, he did something that the people around him found almost incomprehensible. He pulled out a journal and he wrote a single question at the top of a blank page. 10 years from now, what will this have been the beginning of? Not denial. Not false positivity. Not pretending the loss wasn't real or devastating. Just a different time horizon. And from that different time horizon, something else became visible. The lessons embedded in the failure. The relationships that had survived it and therefore proven themselves genuinely valuable. The clarity about his own values that comfort had never produced but crisis had revealed immediately. The skills he now had, forged in the fire of 11 years, that no market downturn could repossess. 10 years later, Lawrence would tell anyone who asked that losing everything was the most important thing that ever happened to him. Not because it didn't hurt. Because from the long arc, from the decade-wide perspective, it was the event that made everything that followed possible. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "Loss is nothing else but change, and change is nature's delight." Train your mind to think in long arcs. When the immediate moment is painful and the short-term perspective shows nothing but damage, deliberately, consciously extend the timeline. Ask what this moment looks like from 5 years forward. From 10. From the vantage point of the person you are in the process of becoming. The view from the long arc almost always reveals something the short reaction cannot see. Habit 7, they take full ownership without self-punishment. This habit lives in the precise and demanding space between 2 failures, and navigating it correctly is one of the clearest markers of a genuinely mature, genuinely resilient mind. The first failure is the refusal of ownership. The habit of explaining every difficulty in terms of external causes. The weather, the economy, the people who didn't support you, the circumstances that weren't fair, the timing that was wrong. There is always a grain of truth in these explanations. External forces are real and their impact is real. But a mind that habitually explains its results primarily through external causes is a mind that has surrendered its own agency. And a mind without agency cannot build anything lasting, because it has placed the source of its outcomes outside itself, where it has no access and no power. The second failure is ownership that collapses into self-punishment. The habit of taking responsibility in a way that immediately becomes self-flagellation. I failed. I always fail. This proves the thing I have always feared about myself. I should have known better. What is wrong with me? This form of ownership is not actually useful, because it is not oriented toward learning and correction. It is oriented toward suffering. And suffering, indulged as a response to failure, produces paralysis rather than growth. Winners live in the space between these two failures with a precision that is genuinely remarkable to observe. They own completely. This happened. I made decisions that contributed to this outcome. I will examine those decisions honestly. And then they redirect immediately. What does this teach me? What do I do differently? What is the next right action? No drama. No extended self-criticism. No performance of remorse that substitutes for the actual work of learning. Epictetus was extraordinarily direct about this. He taught that the only appropriate response to a mistake was to understand it, correct it, and move forward, and that any time spent beyond what was necessary for that process was time stolen from the actual work of living well. You are not your worst decision. You are not your most painful failure. You are not the sum of your most difficult seasons. You are the mind that is examining those things, honestly, without flinching, and with the clear intention of becoming more capable because of them. Own everything. Punish yourself for nothing. Learn from all of it. That is the winner's relationship with their own failures. Habit 8, they curate their environment with intention. Here is something that the most mentally resilient people understand with absolute clarity, something that takes most people far too long to fully accept. You cannot consistently think at a higher level than the environment you are immersed in. This is not a judgment. It is neuroscience. It is sociology. It is the simple, observable, endlessly documented reality that human beings are profoundly social creatures whose thinking, whose standards, whose sense of what is possible and what is normal, are all shaped, continuously and below conscious awareness, by the environment they inhabit. The people around you. The content you consume. The conversations you participate in regularly. The physical spaces you occupy. The voices, real and digital, that have the most consistent access to your mind. All of it is shaping you. The question is not whether your environment is shaping you. It is shaping you. The question is whether you are shaping your environment, deliberately, intentionally, with the clear understanding that the mental world you live in is, to a significant degree, a product of what you have allowed to surround you. A young woman named Kayamika grew up in a neighborhood where the dominant narrative was one of limitation. Not spoken openly, but embedded in the assumptions people made about what was available to them, what was possible, what someone from here could realistically hope to achieve. Kayamika did not have the resources to physically leave that environment for a long time. But she curated relentlessly within it. She was ruthlessly selective about whose voices she allowed to have the most influence on her thinking. She sought out, through books, through deliberately chosen relationships, through every accessible means, the perspectives of people who were living at the level she intended to reach. She limited her exposure to conversations that reinforced the narrative of limitation and sought out conversations that expanded the narrative of possibility. She was not dismissive of her community. She was intentional about which parts of it she allowed to shape her inner world. By the time Kayamika had the resources to physically expand her environment, she had already outgrown the mental limitations that geography alone had not been able to impose on her. Because she had curated her mind's environment before she could curate anything else. Seneca wrote, "Associate with those who will make a better man of you. Welcome those whom you yourself can improve." Look honestly at your environment. The people, the content, the conversations, the voices. Ask, with genuine honesty, whether what surrounds you is pulling your thinking upward or holding it in place. And then curate. Deliberately. Consistently. Without apology. Because the winner's mind is not accidental. It is cultivated. And cultivation always begins with an honest assessment of the soil. Habit 9, they practice gratitude as a discipline, not a feeling. I want to be very precise about this habit, because gratitude, as it is commonly discussed, is almost entirely misunderstood. And the misunderstanding is costing people one of the most powerful mental tools available to them. Gratitude is not a feeling that arises spontaneously when things are going well. That is not gratitude, that is satisfaction. And satisfaction, while pleasant, requires favorable circumstances to exist. The moment circumstances become unfavorable, satisfaction disappears. Which means it offers zero protection for your mental attitude when protection is most needed. Stoic gratitude is something entirely different. It is a discipline, a practice that is deliberately engaged regardless of circumstances, specifically because it produces a particular quality of mind that circumstances alone could never generate. The Stoics practiced what Marcus Aurelius described as negative visualization, the deliberate contemplation of what you have, combined with the honest acknowledgement that none of it is permanent, none of it is guaranteed, and all of it could be otherwise. Not as morbidity. As activation. Because the mind that genuinely, viscerally understands that what it has could be absent, does not take what it has for granted. And a mind that does not take things for granted experiences the ordinary texture of life with a richness, a depth, a quality of genuine appreciation that the habitually ungrateful mind can never access. Think about what this does to a positive mental attitude in practical terms. The person who practices Stoic gratitude walks into a difficult day already in possession of a resource the ungrateful mind doesn't have, the acute, practiced awareness of what is still present, still functional, still available, still good. They are not blind to the difficulty. They see it clearly. But they see it against a backdrop of genuine appreciation for what remains, and that backdrop changes the emotional weight of the difficulty entirely. A winner does not wait to feel grateful. They practice gratitude as a morning discipline, deliberate, specific, and oriented not toward the spectacular but toward the ordinary. The functioning body. The working mind. The relationships that have survived. The options that still exist. The day itself, which is not guaranteed to anyone. Practice this every morning. Before the noise starts. Before the demands arrive. 5 minutes of deliberate, specific, honest acknowledgement of what is present and what is good. It will not make the hard days easy. But it will make them navigable. And navigable, on the hardest days, is everything. Habit 10, they recommit every single day. And now we come to the habit that holds all the others together. The one that is least glamorous, least likely to appear in anyone's highlight reel, and most responsible for the actual, sustained, compounding results that distinguish winners from everyone else. Every single day, they recommit. Not once, at the beginning, in a blaze of motivation and clarity and the particular intoxicating energy of a new beginning. But every day. Including, especially, the days when the motivation is gone, the clarity has clouded over, the results aren't visible yet, and every reasonable voice in the environment is suggesting that the effort is not worth the cost. On those days, the days that nobody photographs, the days that never make the story when the success arrives, winners recommit. And this recommitment is not an emotional event. It is not a motivational speech they give themselves in the mirror. It is not the manufactured enthusiasm of someone trying to feel something they don't currently feel. It is a quiet, deliberate, almost mechanical act of alignment. This is who I have decided to be. This is how I have decided to think. This is the practice. I am doing it today. Not because it feels inspiring. Because it is the commitment. There was a writer named Samuel who spent 4 years writing a book that nobody asked for, in a genre that wasn't fashionable, at a time in his life when the practical pressures to stop and do something more immediately productive were significant and real. Every morning, Samuel sat down at his desk at 5:30. Not because 5:30 felt inspiring. Because 5:30 was the commitment. Some mornings the writing was alive and electric and he emerged from the session feeling like he had touched something real. Those mornings were perhaps 1 in 5. The other 4 mornings were ordinary. Difficult. Sometimes actively discouraging. The words were clumsy, the ideas were half-formed, the progress was invisible and the doubt was loud. Samuel sat down anyway. Every morning. For 4 years. Because he understood, in the bones, not just in the mind, that the recommitment was the work. Not just the prerequisite to the work. The work itself. The daily act of showing up to the practice regardless of how it felt was the primary discipline from which everything else followed. Epictetus wrote, "First say to yourself what you would be. Then do what you have to do." First say to yourself what you would be. A person with an unbreakable positive mental attitude. A person who decides what things mean. Who makes friends with difficulty. Who protects their inner conversation. Who thinks in long arcs. Who owns completely and punishes themselves for nothing. Who curates their environment with intention. Who practices gratitude as a discipline. Who recommits, every single morning, without drama, without waiting for inspiration, to the person they have decided to become. Then do what you have to do. Every day. Without exception. The portrait of the winner's mind. Let me bring all 10 habits together, not as a list, but as a living picture of what this looks like when it is fully inhabited. This person wakes up and before the world makes its first demand, they have already made their first choice. They have chosen their inner conversation. They have practiced their gratitude. They have recommitted to who they are. When difficulty arrives, and it will, it always does, they do not ask why is this happening to me. They ask what does this mean and what does it require of me. They separate the fact from the story. They assign the meaning that serves their forward motion. They engage with the difficulty as a sharpening stone rather than retreating from it as an obstacle. When they fail, and they will, because every person who is attempting anything genuinely difficult will fail, they own it completely, extract the lesson with precision, and move forward without the weight of self-punishment dragging at their momentum. They think in long arcs. They curate their environment. They practice voluntary discomfort. They protect their inner conversation with ferocity. And every single morning, without waiting for motivation, without requiring perfect conditions, without needing anyone else to validate the decision, they recommit. This is not a portrait of someone who never struggles. It is a portrait of someone for whom struggle has become the material of construction rather than the agent of destruction. And here is what I need you to understand about that portrait, the most important thing I will say in this entire conversation. That person is not a type. They are not a personality. They are not a rare configuration of genetics and circumstance that produces exceptional human beings in small quantities and leaves everyone else to manage as best they can. They are the product of practice. Specific. Learnable. Repeatable. Daily practice. The same practice we have been walking through today. Which means, and I want you to receive this with the full weight it deserves, that person is available to you. Not as a distant aspiration. Not as the person you might become under better conditions. As the person you are building, habit by habit, day by day, recommitment by recommitment, starting from this exact moment. The unbreakable positive mental attitude is not found. It is built. And you have everything you need to build it. The final word. You came into this conversation today for a reason. Maybe you are in the middle of something difficult and you needed to be reminded that the difficulty is not the end of the story. Maybe you have been operating on a mental attitude that has been serving you less. This is the Stoic path. And the unbreakable mind you came here looking for. You just started building it.